Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today for A Happier Ending, Writing the Climate Future We Want for Film and TV. This is an event hosted by the Writers Guild of America West and the committee that has put this, it's not a committee, the volunteers who have assembled this panel are Jessica Potter, Jenny Lynn and Dorothy Fortenberry, and I'm very honored to be moderating. My name is Tracy Held. I'm the co-founder of Erosion, an independent film production company dedicated to telling conservation and climate comedies. And I'm also the vice chair of the WGA West Asian American Writers Committee. Before we get started, I'd like to make a brief land acknowledgement. As we gather in this virtual space, we acknowledge that the land we're on is historically the home of Indigenous peoples, many of whom have been forced to leave for other lands. And for those of us living in Los Angeles, we are in the traditional territory of the Chumash and the Tongva peoples, and we invite you to visit native-land.ca to learn more about the land you reside on. And because this is the Writers Guild, we also invite you to check out and watch TV shows and films written by Native and Indigenous writers. We are gathering here with two assumptions. One is that we believe the climate crisis is real, and the other is that we believe part of the solution for addressing the climate crisis is creating a roadmap of positive climate future stories so that we have something that we can all work towards instead of just feeling afraid of potential disaster and devastation. We are joined by three really amazing panelists. We have Catherine Baltazar, who is the Policy Analyst and Organizer for Climate Resolve. Dr. Joe Árvai, professor of psychology and director of the USC Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability, and Kira Snyder, a writer and producer who's known for shows like For All Mankind and The Handmaid's Tale. We're going to start meeting each of our panelists one at a time by asking our first question, which is, can you tell us about the work that you're doing and also share some exciting projects or ventures that you're working on in your space. And if Catherine, we could start with you, that'd be great.
Yeah, of course. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this exciting panel. As was mentioned, my name is Catherine Baltazar. I'm the Senior Policy Analyst and Organizer at a climate nonprofit based in Los Angeles called Climate Resolve. A little bit about my work. I work at the intersection of housing, climate, and social justice, primarily focused on helping frontline communities not only survive, but lead in designing the future that they want to live in, and whether that means addressing extreme heat, air pollution, or the lack of green space that exists in their community. We make sure that the people most affected by the climate crisis are part of shaping the solutions that are meant for them. So right now, one of the most exciting projects that I'm leading is in the community of Boyle Heights in Los Angeles. We're working on a buffer zone project, which is a multi-sector collaboration project grounded in environmental justice and community leadership. We've brought together about 15 partners, which includes city agencies, community-based organizations, and then residents to help co-design a suite of interventions that tackle the public health risks caused by the heavy industry in the community, and then also the nearby LA freeway interchange that cuts across it as well. And so some of the work that we're including as part of that includes things like adding more trees, simply to help us reduce the air pollution and air quality impacts that are affecting the community. We're also trying to bring in mobility improvements to help bring in more bike share, for example, improve sidewalk upgrades and improve curb ramps for accessibility. And then we're also trying to think through like community resilience hubs, for example, which are spaces that would provide year-round resources for cooling, learning, and community organizing, especially in the face of extreme heat that's really impacting the community. And so to me, what makes a project like this powerful is how deeply it's rooted in community leadership. We didn't just check a box. We co-created training tools, led engagement sessions, and are really centering residents in the policy and design process of the work we're doing. And I think right now, We're primarily focused on securing funding for implementation, but the vision that we've been developing with community has already ignited momentum, and we're excited to see what comes out of it in the coming year.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to ask Catherine more questions about the work she's doing and her thoughts of how we could tell positive future climate stories. But I'd like to also check in with Joe real quick. Are you able to hop on and share some of the work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thank you for including me in this conversation. To you and the Writers Guild, as a fan of your work, I mean, I think more than entertainment, you're sort of the conscience of society in many ways, and I'm very grateful for all of your hard work and your creativity. Um, as Tracy said, I'm the director of the Wrigley Institute for Environment and Sustainability at USC. Before I came to USC, I started my career as an environmental scientist. I worked as an oceanographer and climate scientist for many years. And then when it came time to go back and do my PhD, I became very interested in why people say that they care about things like the environment, but then don't really act accordingly. So I went back and did a PhD that at the intersection of communication, economics, and psychology to really understand how people, process information, how they conceptualize challenges and problems and opportunities. What kinds of kind of baked in psychological tendencies cause people to see the world in the way that they see it, and ultimately that prevent them from making decisions in a way that, is in line with sort of the complexity of the challenges that we're dealing with. And really that boils down to people's inability or lack of desire to make difficult trade-offs most of the time. In my own work, I do a lot of research with a team of postdocs and graduate students and colleagues focused on everything from how people perceive climate risks to developing decision support tools that allow individuals and organizations to make decisions in a more thoughtful and defensible way when it comes to climate. I've worked as a federal science advisor on two stints fired by the Trump administration. Both times they came in. But really trying to get as much knowledge out there about how the world sees challenges like climate change and how we can help them to make decisions about it in a more comprehensive way. And other projects, I mean, we have at the Wrigley Institute, which is USC's de facto environment school, a large project funded by the Balmer Group on climate and carbon management. It really focuses on decarbonization and finding ways to remove legacy carbon dioxide emissions from the atmosphere. It interfaces with local communities here in Southern California, but elsewhere in the United States, and brings together the social and the behavioral sciences, the natural and geophysical sciences, and also the arts and the humanities. Other things that we're really excited about, we have a large art and storytelling initiative underway at the Wrigley Institute, where we work with scientists and writers to help them do as you're trying to do here at this session. And, I could go on, but I think that gives you a sense of where we're at.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Also have lots of questions for you. Kira, would you mind sharing a little bit about your experience, especially as a writer?
Sure. And again, thank you so much to the organizers and volunteers for putting this amazing panel together. Obviously very timely. I've been a writer-producer since 2007, mostly in sci-fi and genre, and I seem to specialize in dystopias. I've worked on dystopian shows. The Handmaid's Tale kind of most recently in that vein. Although I will say Gilead, the terrible theocratic enslaving government of the show. Gilead is actually very green. The one thing they did right is they cleaned up the environment, cleaned up the air, cleaned up the water. But it seems to be implying that comprehensive climate policy is only possible if you have an authoritarian government. I don't think that's true. So I've worked on dystopias, and for storytellers and for audiences, they're compelling for lots of different reasons. I just want to underscore something you said at the beginning, Tracy, about the importance of telling positive stories, because this is where cognitive science kind of comes into play. We are wired to look for the bad in things. This is an ancient evolutionary survival strategy. But again, cognitive science shows us that kind of imagery getting reinforced over and over again literally makes it harder to imagine and therefore work for a positive future. Like literally the same brain processes that we use to remember the past are how we construct scenarios for the future. So it does, and it's not just a bummer that we only see dystopian stories. We're actually making it harder for ourselves as a society to think about the positive future. So in my own work, although I still love a good survival story, I'm actually working on one right now, but I'm also looking for what Kevin Kelly and other futurists have called protopias, which is a term that I came to learn a few years ago. So you have dystopias, we know what those are. Utopias, they're not great for storytellers because they're perfect and therefore impossible to achieve. They can be boring. And also often utopias are only utopian for some people, and then they're dystopians for everybody else. But protopia is, the concept is that it's suggesting a future that is not perfect, but where tomorrow is better than today and yesterday. So the Star Trek universe is the classic example. Plenty of room for stake and conflicts and drama, but it is a future that is positive. I would also say the alternate timeline on For All Mankind, the show I've been working on most recently, is also a bit of a protopia. A lot of the conceit of the show has our timeline in the show on a kind of more positive climate path, but there's still plenty of conflict and stakes, and it just arises from different areas. So I'm definitely, again, still very interested in the survival stories and the what if, and also really for being dystopians, like the things I find most compelling are stories of community action and resilience, and those absolutely come into play in the kind of stories that I think we want to talk about today.
That's a really great transition for coming back to Catherine. Catherine, you said something interesting about how the work that you're doing is you have all this great collaboration and planning that's community driven, but you do need investments in order to actually implement the strategies that you've already cultivated in community with a variety of partners. Um, how I'm just going to say that I believe that part of how you achieve that is by having a narrative that people understand so that when you're asking for funding and recruiting resources, you can actually get that funding. Can you tell us, um, part of today is really about hearing specific examples of possible things that could happen in the future that real people are doing or real people are envisioning so that those of us who are in the space and are writers can implement some of those real life things into our work. Can you share some examples of um, the community building or the strategies that you are working on and um, trying to implement here in Los Angeles?
Yeah, definitely. I think part of what I'm realizing, and I really love the topic of this panel because it's a really like a narrative shift of moving away from this doom gloom that we tend to like have when it comes to talking about climate issues, and even taking that kind of narrative to the community and saying, hey, in addition to every other socioeconomic challenge that you're dealing with, we have climate change. Deal with that. And it's really hard for people to like really want to care about something that they think they can't change. So it's important to make sure that when we're talking about these narratives, we're also bringing in the idea of dreaming and envisioning, and then having the process be, okay, let's bring change to your community because we need it, because your community is having all of these impacts from climate change. But how do we envision that? How do we dream about it in a way where folks feel that they're part of that process and that they're owning that process? And I think the beautiful part about working with community is that they're already dreaming. They just don't tell you about it. They don't share it. It's not seen in the ways that we want to see them. If we talk about media and how it depicts, for example, low-income communities, it's always around service industry jobs. It's always about getting immigrants into work. And it creates them to fit in a bubble that as we're moving through every decade, things change and people are able to see that there's differences coming from that. And I think that the way we engage our community right now in Boyle Heights, for example, a lot of times it's a listening place to be in. You have to hear out what their lived experiences are, what their concerns are, and then see how we can tie those priorities that are at the forefront for everyone's daily life into what actions we can do as an organization that's there to help. Oftentimes a lot of it is just elevating concerns that have existed for a very long time and seeing how we can be a bridge builder, can be a mediator, can be a connector. And that includes funding. We oftentimes, when we talk to funders, they don't know the stories that are existing out there because it sometimes exists beyond their own perspectives. And so it's a matter of making sure that communities, when they're talking to funders, that they're able to feel like they can do that. They have access to being able to ask people for what they need. And it's not a question, I think, about how we save communities, right? I don't want that to be either the other side of the coin. I wouldn't want it to be like very white savior complex that we can sometimes see in media and on television or on film. I think it's a way of making sure that when we're telling these stories, that they're being told by the people whose stories it comes from and who they belong to. So I think that's always been helpful for us, is community members can feel part of the process, can lead the process, design it, and all of that helps them inspire me, for example, to keep going on and doing the work we're doing.
That's awesome. Can you share a couple of examples of things that community members have dreamed up that they've shared with you that they would love to see in their communities?
Yeah, so oftentimes I think the biggest concern with the community when you're dealing with like how do we improve it is displacement and gentrification. Those are the two biggest concerns. People want their communities to be better, but at the same time are afraid of it because they think that would mean higher rent prices. That would mean them having to move away from their communities. So the goal of our conversations is always like, how do we envision change in the community so that community members can still stay there and have access to those changes that are being brought up by that. And so I think one of my favorite parts of working with community members is also realizing that a lot of what they want is ownership over their land, ownership over the places where they live. So that community ownership piece of it, making sure that they're able to invest in their community and stay there, is huge for the folks that we engage with. So whenever we're talking about any type of climate solution, we have to keep in mind that displacement and gentrification are at the forefront of their minds, and making sure that the solutions we're bringing aren't going to exacerbate that. And that as we're advocating for changes that are happening in infrastructure or related to something more concrete, that we're taking it back at the policy level and advocating for policies that will restrict them from being displaced as changes are happening. So I think it's a tie of those two things, making sure that we're pragmatic, but also encouraging that kind of envisioning and dreaming process.
That makes a lot of sense. And you alluded to working on heat issues. Can you elaborate on what that is and how that affects people, especially living in a city environment?
Definitely. So Los Angeles, overall, I mean, of course, there's a lot of different climate zones, so different parts of Los Angeles deal with different climate impacts. But in the part of Los Angeles that I'm talking about, so Boyle Heights, extreme heat is the biggest concern. Extreme heat, which means like days that are higher than 95 degrees Fahrenheit, are extreme heat days. And so we're seeing those extreme heat days it come often more. And then we're also seeing those heat waves last longer. So we're having a hard time with communities like not being able to adapt and adjust to the heat that's coming, partly because of the built environment that they exist in. So for example, Boyle Heights, it's home to over 100 industrial factories. It's also being cut in half by the freeway interchange that I mentioned earlier. And so those two things are compounded already to create a built environment that's going to be dealing with air quality concerns and then also industrial emissions. But then you also have to add in the layer that Boyle Heights has seen a historic disinvestment in the community around greening. So it also has a low tree canopy, which means that shade's also hard to come by. But now we exist in an environment where planting a tree isn't as easy as it used to be because it's so hot now. If you plant a tree, is it actually going to survive to create the shade that we're looking for, to filter the air that we're hoping for it to do? And so we're in this place where we need to start thinking about complementary strategies tied to how we can cool community down in the near term, while also having that be a catalyst for change in the long term. So if we wanted to plant a tree, for example, Climate Resolve has been leading a lot of good work around developing cooling strategies like cool pavements, which would reflect that heat, so it no longer stays in the roads that we see. And then we're hoping that those kinds of strategies can help bring down the heat that communities are dealing with with their already current existence. So applying cooling technology like cool pavements doesn't require you to actually go and excavate land and actually have to like displace anybody. It's a solution that can be applied currently with the situation, with the circumstances that a community's in. So it's things like that. It's being able to understand like what different communities are living through and what the existing infrastructure looks like and how we can promote strategies that can help mitigate some of those heat impacts that you're seeing, air quality impacts, and more.
That's really interesting. When you were talking about managing heat waves and lowering temperatures, I assumed that we would want to remove certain infrastructure and replace it with more natural, like greenery and stuff like that. But then the first example that you came up with was actually more technology that cools the temperature. So I thought that was really interesting. Joe, do you have anything else to add about specific strategies, or maybe not even strategies, but specific visions of the way Los Angeles could be designed so that it's more livable in the future?
You know, I don't have much to add. I mean, I think Catherine's done a really good job of outlining a lot of the challenges that are present. I mean, I think Los Angeles is so incredibly diverse, both in terms of its population, but also in terms of its geography, that that there is going to be like no one size fits all solution for the entirety of the city. Of course, we have coastal issues that we have to contend with respect to sea level rise and storm surge and all this kind of stuff. But I would argue further that obviously the fires in the eastern part of the city, and to some degree on the western side. I mean, those are all climate fueled disasters. COVID was a climate fueled disaster. People becoming closer and closer to a part of an ecosystem that we're just not equipped to handle, whether you subscribe to the lab leak philosophy or the open public market philosophy. So I just think keeping in mind that, that the world is complex, even a city, as relatively small compared to the world as Los Angeles is, even though it's a huge city in America, is complex. And maybe from the standpoint of something that may be of import to the people on this in this seminar, is that for a lot of people who are thinking about climate change, or who maybe better yet aren't thinking about climate change, the world goes way beyond Los Angeles, right? So there's just so much of the world and the country where climate issues just aren't really front and center, and I think in a lot of cases for good reason. And we're not doing a good enough job, I think, in really connecting with people there. So, to extend, to the southern part of Southern California and then heading east across New Mexico and into Texas, migration is a climate story. And we don't treat it as such. We don't instinctively think about it as such. We, in many swaths of the country, think about it as a criminal act, or a political refugee or asylum type situation. And in many cases, it's just people moving to have more and greater access to a more livable environment that provides a wide range of benefits. So anyway, I think, yeah, I'll stop there.
Well, Joe, I think it's interesting. Part of your work has also been understanding human behavior and how they make decisions and why they might do things, even if they know that they should make a different choice that maybe is better for the environment. Um, in the spirit of trying to understand how we can tell stories about human beings um, in film and TV that help create this roadmap for more positive climate futures. Current life on this planet, we have a lot of challenges, but we also have a lot of opportunities. And I'm curious if there are any behaviors that you understand humans have that could be a model for how we can make better climate choices?
Oh, yeah. I think one of the areas that we do work on in my research group is something called psychological distance. And basically it sort of argues that the closer someone is to something, the more complex and varied and deep their understanding of what's going on can be. So psychological distance, and the further away something is, it's more abstract for them. So psychological distance unfolds across time. Things that are happening in the future are more concrete than things happening in the present are more concrete than things happening in the future. Things happening close to us are more concrete than things happening far away. Things that happen to people that we identify with are more concrete. Things that happen to or with people that are, culturally far away from us are more abstract. And then the last one is probability. Things that are more certain in terms of probability feel concrete. Think about the flu, more recently about COVID. Things that are kind of less probable are more abstract. And climate change ticks all of those boxes. For a lot of us around the world, and unless you're in really kind of disproportionately affected places, climate change happens far away to others in the future with some lower probability, right? They keep telling us 2050. That's a long time away. We got a long time to figure this out. And the reality is that it's a lot closer than that to all of us. So if you think about things like, the fires here in LA, that felt very close and personal for us. And it wasn't necessarily, for most people, a climate story. If you think about Hurricane Katrina, that wasn't necessarily a climate story, even though, it also was. If you think about famines in sub-Saharan Africa, same thing. It's a climate story, even though people don't necessarily think about it that way. So, I build on something that Kira said earlier. I wasn't familiar with the concept of protopia. I was thinking about it a little bit differently, but I think we're on the same wavelength. And that is that, I think that me as a storyteller, because I think about myself as a storyteller too, even though my genre is different from yours, we're not doing a very good job of making people understand that climate change is kind of normal background. It's here, it's now, it's happening to us and others right now in the present with a high probability. So, it's when it does get portrayed, it gets portrayed in a very kind of audacious way. I think about the recent Apple series that Dorothea was part of. I think about The Day After Tomorrow. These are like big, like kind of like in your face climate stories. What I don't see, which I wish I saw, is that narrative arc on shrinking where a young person is dealing with climate anxiety. Like that could be a very humorous and uplifting and positive story, just as, a young person, grieving the loss of a parent could be. I think about, the White Lotus Maldives, where people are oblivious to the fact that, their resort is sinking beneath the surface of the ocean. Like it doesn't have to be, it doesn't have to be, climate change doesn't always have to be serious and in your face and the main sort of plot point. It can just be the background that helps to sort of set the narrative in motion. And that too often doesn't happen. And instead, we get these very kind of like pendulum kind of swingy kind of narratives around climate where it's not at all there, or it's so in your face that it's become cartoonish in a way.
Kira, I'm interested in if you have, especially hearing this panel so far, if you have any thoughts about ways that you like telling climate positive climate futures or that you wish you could do in the future.
Yeah, I'm very much on the same page with you, Joe. Some of the things you talked about were definitely things that I've been thinking about in terms of, climate stories and how to have them be impactful, because it's a challenge, because the climate stories that are in your face, it kind of asks the question, like, who is this show for? Because the people who really need to hear this message may not watch it. And the people who are on board with the message, what are you telling them to activate them, to motivate them, rather than just reinforcing what they already know? So there is a challenge when it's right out there. and also it can often be abstract. So I definitely agree that it needs to be, and it's interesting to hear about it from the psychological distance point of view. I definitely think about it from a storytelling point of view, is that climate change can be abstract, it can feel remote. And for storytellers, for writers, it needs to be personal and, and relatable. And that doesn't necessarily mean, identical to your own lived experience, but it needs to be attached to characters, attached to faces. And so I did this sort of thought exercise of stories, not necessarily climate, but like things that are modeling, behaviors and approaches that I find impressive. And it's actually a lot of the work that Catherine, that you're doing. Like, let's make the activists and collective action and the community the heroes of these things. People getting involved in local elections, people getting involved in civics, for God's sake, again. And really showing and really bring it really local, like your Boyle Heights project. I mean, I think the tree project in Boyle Heights, like that could absolutely be a story, and making it really local and really relatable. It's like the more specific you are, the more universal a story can be. But yeah, I was just sort of thinking about like, okay, so it's easy to imagine an Erin Brockovich in the climate world, a Norma Ray with the climate world. I was thinking about like, and climate as, I was thinking about, it's kind of slightly different words as yours, Joe, but thinking about climate as context rather than message, and also tying climate to character, as I mentioned before. So something that's good for us as writers is that, fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of climate stories are kind of by their very nature underdog stories, and who doesn't love an underdog story? We love underdog stories. And a lot of those are successful because you kind of meet people where they are, right? So you have something, you can imagine like a big sprawling family drama like a Yellowstone or a Dallas, but it's about a family who is losing their farm or has to pivot from oil for any number of reasons. And it's about the family. It's about all those juicy, soapy dynamics, but the context is climate. Mr. Smith goes to Washington, a young politician and a young Congress member goes to Washington, has a progressive climate issue, and it's about power dynamics. It's about running into the DC machine, but you give them as a character in this case, kind of a climate motivation. I just sort of just, looking at other options, even something as kind of, actiony and broadly successful as like a Reacher or a Night Agent. Those are ultimately stories about someone like interceding to protect somebody or right or wrong. They could be protecting a climate scientist who has some like explosive information, or even this season of Reacher. I'm not going to spoil it, but like part of the reason the bad guys were the bad guys is they were poisoning a town, poisoning the river of a town. So that's like a low key climate story. And you have someone like Reacher. And this show's massively successful, caring about those things. And I think that has a kind of a cumulative effect. I mean, you guys may be aware of this, but like something like in the 70s and 80s, there were these Brazilian soap operas, and studies have shown that those soap operas actually changed women's rights during that time, because characters were not having as many kids, deciding to leave in marriages where they weren't happy or were being abused. And so actually what really happened, the studies show that women were having fewer babies in Brazil, in areas where those telenovelas were being broadcast. More divorces were happening. It was like women kind of taking more responsibility because they saw characters making these choices. So that kind of cumulative effect, especially for TV, can really be powerful. I mean, Will and Grace can be argued really laid the groundwork for the mass acceptance of marriage equality. So kind of making it, whether it's a movie where it's, it's like an Erin Brockovich type situation, or it's a TV show where you're kind of low key reinforcing this. I feel like there's like lots of really, and that's not even getting into, sci-fi and alternate history. Like all the examples I gave were like really kind of in our world. And also just thinking about other genres where, climate feels like it really could and should be part of it. I just, I have family members who are evangelicals, and there's a big evangelical environmentalist movement. These are people who take the Bible very seriously in terms of being stewards of the environment, being stewards of creation. Dorothy, who most of you know, the Laudato Si is her favorite encyclical by the Pope, and that was an environmental thing. So there's a faith-based angle that could be at play here. So there's tons of opportunity. It just takes the will of the writer and the will of the industry, frankly, to get behind it.
Could I add to that real quick, if you don't mind? I mean, I think, it's funny because in my notes here I wrote down Yellowstone, and I think Kira's absolutely right. I mean, those, I think the the renewable energy kind of piece of it. Even a fracking story, for crying out loud, around natural gas would be a step up from, drilling for crude. There's certainly other things, though, that I think are really important. And again, I think about what Kira just said about sort of putting things in the background that really are cues for a different kind of future. So, one of your characters placing a call to someone. This is sort of a device in many shows I've seen where someone's on the phone discussing something. Why aren't they on the phone while they're charging their EV? Like, why aren't they like making the call while they're plugging in? Like, there are so many things that could happen. To the family angle, I've often wondered why, there are these shows of, the patriarch of the family loses their job and, turns to, burglary or crime. I think John Hamm has got one of these things coming out now. Why isn't that person someone who's being displaced in the coal industry while his neighbors are moving into renewables? He or she decides that, the easier way is to rob banks. And that could be serious, it could be comedy, it doesn't matter, but it's just a different spark for the narrative. So, the coal, that you're not being beaten over the head by a climate story, but you are beginning to understand that climate has real consequences for real people that leads them to do different things in different ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. And Kira already mentioned an example of Reacher offering a climate story, and I'm curious if either our panelists or honestly anybody who's um, attending this panel right now has examples of other shows that or films that have done a good job of telling a positive climate story so that we can use that as a reference moving forward. If you want to put that in the chat, maybe our behind the scenes moderators can add it to a list and we'll just recite some of these examples at the end. Um, I'm curious if any of you have thought about either other examples of things that you wish writers would stop doing when they're talking about climate, or other examples of things that we as writers could do better.
I mean, one thing that comes out of the work that my group does is on understanding that any decision that one needs to make that has any real kind of consequence. I think of a lot of the things that Catherine is working on right now, and Climate Resolve is amazing work in the area. Um, is that the problems are complicated. The alternatives that people have to choose from for addressing that problem are manifold. Those alternatives themselves are made up of lots of individual attributes. They cost different amounts of money. They take different amounts of time. They have different degrees of success. They, are more or less equitably distributed depending on what you're thinking about. Um, all of which is to say that it's complicated and people have to make trade-offs. People have to wrestle with moral dilemmas. And I wish that were more present in narratives. There aren't easy solutions oftentimes, because if there were, we would have deployed them. I love the show Hacks. I think the writing is just amazing. There was an episode of Hacks, and I think it was in the third season, where the two principals are kind of lost in the woods and they have this conversation about consumption. And I think it was a really nice teachable moment, but it loses sight of the fact that there's a whole lot of complexity behind those consumption arguments that doesn't really see the light of day. And I don't think it could see the light of day, in a 27-minute, situational comedy. So I think there are these other things that I just think the complexity of what's going on needs to be addressed in a way that is narratively compelling, but also to some degree real about the nature of the challenges people like Catherine are working with every day.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, actually, I think it's interesting to hear like almost like a lot of these are very fictional examples, but I think that a lot of what I was thinking of is more documentary based, because there is so much power that comes from films that are documentary, very real. And one example for me that really stood out is this short film called Biking While Black that was directed and co-produced very locally in Los Angeles by Yolanda Davis Overstreet. And to me, it's more than just a film about cycling. Like they really address like what it is about mobility justice, because it doesn't exist in a vacuum. it centers like experiences of both Black and brown cyclists who are not only just navigating traffic or riding their bikes, but also dealing with the systemic racism and over policing that affects people on a day-to-day basis. That I think oftentimes we ignore that when we're talking about fictional filmmaking. And I think the film really also shows the balance between how biking can still be a source of joy and freedom and connection for a community, but that safety isn't equally accessible to everybody. And I think that like being able to share those kinds of voices that are rooted in justice helps us also shift the narrative in storytelling, helps us challenge policies that exist that are affecting people, and really push for change in a way that doesn't happen with fictional filmmaking and storytelling, because it exists in that vacuum of like it's not real. But I think documentaries have the ability to really show how versatile and powerful filmmaking can be for organizing, and really get people who see themselves in stories being told on how they can be part of change. Because oftentimes, like especially for BIPOC communities, climate change, like, and I think Joe also brought this up earlier, it doesn't exist on its own. It's not just one issue that's in the background. Like everyone is dealing with it in a different way because it's intersected across the board with a variety of different issues. Climate change has to do with public transit access. Climate change affects like how people are able to get jobs, because as we transition to like moving out of gasoline vehicles and moving towards battery powered vehicles, do we have the green workforce that's able to like handle that transition for that industry? So there's a lot that's happening on a day-to-day basis that I think oftentimes isn't shown enough anymore on television or in film. And I think that it's a great opportunity to be part of that pivoting moment in the way we're doing our media now. So I think that's just like, for me, a lot of what I was thinking has more to do with like the realism aspect, even though I know sometimes we go to the movies or we watch TV to escape our real lives. I still think it's a chance for us to like use those moments for people to find motivation or be inspired or learn about new things happening.
Catherine, is there an example of some kind of climate strategy that's been implemented in real life that either inspires you or you think would be cool to see on screen?
A strategy. So I think, I think now we've been shifting a lot from how we used to do funding. For example, there's this program, and I'm sorry if I get very technical on this, but there is a program in California called the TCC project, which is a Transformative Climate Communities grant. And it's the first time there's ever been a funding source that's funding multiple strategies in a specific community. Because oftentimes communities, like I said, there's a mixture of like issues that they need to get funding for. You need to get trees, you need to get shade, you need to get better transit, you need to get better housing. And so oftentimes the reason it takes so long for communities to get access to those resources is you have to look for different funding for everything that you want to change in your community. But programs like the TCC program in California are able to invest in a community with what they need specifically, like place-based. So I always like imagine like if I could have documented what the community looked like before this kind of investment and then after, and see that happen and the hurdles and everything that comes with it, and like the realism of like that kind of impact, it would inspire funding to happen that way, because change will be shown in a way that makes sense. And I think oftentimes we're afraid to try new things because we don't know what's going to come out of those kinds of investments. But to have examples of like, this is what positive investment looks like in a community, this is how change looks like, you should continue doing this type of funding strategies. I think those are the kinds of things that would really make an impact for a lot of the communities that are out there looking for resources and access and trying to get access to them.
That's awesome. I really want to underscore that point, that it can be helpful for organizers, for activists, for community members to get support by way of funding when their stories of accomplishment or potential accomplishment can be depicted, so that these funders or people with resources understand what the possibilities are. That's really awesome. We do have a couple of questions that I want to start pulling into the conversation. Joe, you kind of started talking a little bit about this, but with the climate crisis as a backdrop of climate stories, are there specific actions you'd like to see modeled on screen? We kind of talked a little bit about um, thoughts, thought approaches, but are there actual physical behaviors that people could do or physical actions?
It's a really good question. So I think making individual level climate behaviors, normal and cool is always a good thing. Um, and I think that's sort of the really low-hanging fruit, right? Like having your characters and your backdrops be just in tune with the reality of climate change. So I mentioned earlier the EVs, I mentioned earlier about things like climate anxiety and the things that kind of keep people up at night and how people have to deal with that or being asked to deal with that. I think Catherine brings up the issue of shade. Um, much in the same way that, characters stopped smoking on screen. Characters can now start doing different kinds of things on screen. Um, James Bond can drive an electric Aston Martin. I mean, there's all kinds of things that can happen. But what I also want to say though is that, the real solutions, like the really kind of the things that are going to get us to 1.5 by 2050 that are going to lead to gigaton scale carbon removal and carbon reduction, sadly aren't going to be individual behaviors. They're going to be these big systemic changes. So beginning to portray the system, and I saw this come up in the comments at some point, you know, behaviors and changes to the system or the evolution of the system, I think is just as important, if not more so, to help people conceptualize the magnitude of the challenge and then at what scale things are going to have to happen. It would be nice if, wind farms were part of the background of a story and maybe even, part of the narrative that sort of explains a little bit without being too heavy-handed about what and why, so that that becomes something that people can think about and have in their minds as a positive rather than news stories that, wind farms caused cancer, which is complete bullshit. But that's, those are the kinds of things that get airtime, right? So I think the big systemic things are even more important to some degree than the individual things.
That makes a lot of sense. Do you mind clarifying you threw out this number 1.5? Can you explain
So
what you're
there,
talking about?
yeah, I'm sorry. The Paris Climate Agreement negotiated, compliance or buy-in from the companies and the countries in the Conference of Parties Pact to keep warming to no more than 1.5 degrees centigrade by 2050 to avoid irreversible climate damage. And it's a bit of an arbitrary number. There was discussion in 2015 when the 1.5 number came out that, we would need to keep warming below that. We went past 1.5 last year. We're probably going to go further past it this year. So now they're saying, well, we can overshoot as long as we can dial it back in the future. But the point is, we climate scientists are trying to sort of think about ways from a technological standpoint and a decarbonization standpoint to, by 2050, reduce warming, heating, climate heating, whatever you want to call it, to no more than plus 1.5 degrees centigrade relative to 2015 levels by 2050.
That's helpful. And so potentially just throwing this out there for people listening, a positive climate future might be one in which we're well within that 1.5 degrees, like that we shift this trend so that we're not bumping against climate disaster.
Yeah, but
Uh,
keep in mind that 1.5 degrees is going to be uncomfortable. It's just not going to be as uncomfortable as 2.5 degrees.
Or what if we got to a situation where we were kind of balanced with our environment and we weren't even needing to measure warming anymore? Because, well, not that we, anyway. I'm gonna ask Kira a question. Um, what are some things that you wrote into, or, the teams who worked on Handmaid's Tale or For All Mankind, um, that made these society you because you talked about Gilead had a way of actually having a positive climate element, but it came at the expense of living under an authoritarian regime. If I'm understanding this question correctly, um, can you share some of the other examples, or can you just discuss ways that climate snuck into these stories, um, and how, yeah,
Yeah,
thank
yeah,
you.
definitely. I mean, in the case of Handmaid's Tale, we really kind of looked at, here is this oppressive regime that is committed to raising the fertility rate, and as they would look around our now, like cleaning up the water, cleaning up the air, cleaning up the land, that can only help. And in later seasons, that becomes their kind of calling card, like, well, look, the birth rate is rising only in Gilead. So yeah, so when you see the show, the production designers worked really hard to really make it feel like, and it was all electric vehicles, and just thinking about the way things were designed, really keeping it lower power consumption. I mean, I don't know if we actually saw solar panels specifically, but definitely it's a world that was technological insofar as it helped clean up the environment. In the case of For All Mankind, I mean, that's an alternate history. Actually, technically, they're both alternate history stories. But in For All Mankind, one of the early conceits in an earlier season, if you haven't seen the show, it's on Apple TV Plus. It's a 4 seasons are out. This season's coming out later this year. But the show jumps a decade between seasons, so it's really fun to sort of see what has developed. So it's a bit of the butterfly effect. So one of the elements of the story early in the show is that NASA has been allowed to patent things it's discovered. So NASA is extremely well funded. And they also are able to kind of commercialize things they've invented. So in the world of For All Mankind, we had EVs decades before we had them here, and they're sort of ubiquitous. So you sort of think about the butterfly effect there, like what climate disasters would not happen because the world, is well within the Celsius increase that Joe's talking about. Maybe Katrina wasn't a thing. Maybe Katrina was just a bad storm, and the levees held because climate disaster had been avoided by adopting EV stuff early on. And another show I worked on, which is not technically a protopia, but I do want to kind of loop back to something sparking from something Joe said. I worked on a show called Eureka on the Sci-Fi Channel, and that was a sci-fi dramedy, definitely science fiction, very much fiction, but it was really science positive, right? It was like a small town full of geniuses, and some science thing would often be the cause of the crisis of the week, but also would be the solution. Science and collective action. Those are like the things I'm super positive about. So let's make, and so the heroes of the show, there was a sheriff who was kind of the everyman, but the heroes of the show were scientists. Let's model, teachers, scientists. Let's try to claw back expertise as something to be valued, not to be scared about, or take it back from we do our own research. People, scientists should be the heroes, because that's where we are seeing a lot of positivity, a lot of positive growth. I mean, I have friends who are more dialed into the climate world than I specifically am, and they go to the Council of Parties, the Conference of Parties conferences, and some of them come back really excited, which I find really gratifying. I mean, there's like a ton of work being done in a lot of areas globally, like decarbonizing the power sector, which is like a big thing. The fact that I was given was that the world added about 620 gigawatts of power generation in 2024, and 90% of that was in renewables, mostly solar, which is like, that's great. So that train is very much moving. I just feel like as a culture, we need to valorize the teachers, the scientists, the community activists, the people working in their, around the community. And really, that comes to us as storytellers. Like, who are the heroes? Who are the villains? We've had villains of all kinds over the years. Corporate speaking, like polluters and big pharma. Like, let's get some people that are the bad guys of climate. Let's have them be the bad guys of some of our stories for a change. Just have the good guys be the kind of people like Joe and Catherine, to be honest, and you too, Tracy. Let's have these heroes of our stories.
I'm for that. I think that's awesome. And it doesn't even have to be a story about me. I'm still a fan. Catherine, we got a question for you. Thinking about community leadership and ownership of climate solutions to issues in the community's areas, how important is it for those with more resources like the billionaires and millionaires, celebrities, social or cultural influencers, or anyone else with a big platform to be a part of the solutions? Do we need them? Is it futile to try to speak to them? What are your thoughts?
I saw that question come up and I started thinking about it because I think it's a twofold kind of question. I think the first part is yes, because the 1% that's contributing to like the damages that's happening to our planet are also the wealthier individuals who have all of the income that exists. And so I think that the we do need them partly because funding, if you're applying for any type of funding, sometimes there's a lot of administrative burdens that can make it really hard for people to access that kind of funding and have to go through like the actual spend down. You can only use like the restrictions that can come from funding also affect our ability to actually implement change. And so I think oftentimes when you have this kind of philanthropic party is able to tell you, here, we heard your story, we know what you need, here's the resources to it. And that kind of freedom that comes with that is incredibly important in the work that we're doing on the ground. At the same time, like you also, if you encourage this, you don't want to have the influencer behavior that is only going to make things worse. Because you wouldn't want the investment that goes in to have also with it negative repercussions. And that's, I think, the fear when it comes around gentrification, right? And displacement. If you're making places more livable, folks that don't belong there are going to want to go live there. So do you want to encourage that at the same time? And I think part of that is always if we can get the funding to be done in a way that's equitable for all, that's the important aspect, I think, of reaching those kinds of folks who have those kinds of resources and making them part of the change to happen. But it's also making sure that they're doing it with good intentions and that it's not coming from a place of extraction or a place of displacement either. So I think it's the two things that come from that kind of engagement.
Awesome. And we actually only have one more minute left. So the final question is if um, each of our panelists have any thoughts of great sources for reporting on climate issues, especially ones with positive climate solutions, um, would you like to share any of them with us?
Trying to think of positive. I think I like to follow for Los Angeles LAist. LAist has a lot of good coverage on a lot of the issues affecting the Los Angeles region. So I'm not sure if it doesn't always have a positive end, but it's very real in terms of how it does its reporting. So I would recommend that. And I didn't see that one on the list.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, and again, not so much just like positive, just very in-depth, persistent reporting. I'm a big fan of ProPublica. They do fantastic, deep investigative reporting. And in addition to kind of, national and global stories, they have a program where they, again, work very hyper local. They will partner with a news organization, newspaper, or radio station or TV station in a community and really work with them, give them the resources to do investigative reporting in that community. And those often are climate-based stories. So that's a ProPublica. It's a fantastic organization.
And I'll echo everything that I've heard and add that, I try to not go to media that makes me mad. And I don't mean that in the way that I'm trying to avoid hard stories, but there are some media outlets, certainly many more these days, where it's just the anger machine and they're on the left and they're on the right. And I don't necessarily want to be angry. I want to be informed. I want to think deeply. So I tend to go to places where I can do that. Strangely, I find that the Wall Street Journal makes me less mad than the New York Times. Um, I find outlets like The Guardian in the UK, help me think deeply. ProPublica for sure, LAist for sure, Fix the News for sure. But anger and cynicism are not things that I like, so I tend to avoid the cynical stuff. But I also would say just two things that I think that sort of build on things that Catherine and Kira both said is spend time with scientists. Like we're kind of fun. Like we do weird things. We like to drink and smoke and do all the bad things that everyone else likes to do. And we're not nerds with pocket protectors. So spend some time with us, and I think you'll be inspired. Spend some time with community people like Catherine, activists, people who are engaging. You'll be inspired. And maybe most of all, spend time with young people. Because not only are they going to be the most affected, but they also tend to be the most hopeful. And, I'm not young anymore, but I feel like I stay younger, at least mentally, because I spend so much time with teenagers and 20-year-olds. And that makes a huge difference.
Thank you all so much for speaking and for attending this event. Our goal was to inspire writers to conceptualize and tell positive climate stories to inspire the general public on how we can actually get through some challenging climate times. Thank you to the WGA and to Tiffany and Doug for making this possible. I'm saving the chat, and maybe there's some way that we can share some of the resources that people shared. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.